True story. 3 weeks ago, right here in the city of Diamond Bar, California, there was an episode of domestic violence in a public parking lot. 2 women witnessed this event. They saw a man shoving a woman against a car and then hitting her repeatedly. Well, what were they to do? One of them called 911, while the other one videoed what was happening. The police came, there was a conversation with that couple. The police left. The couple got into their car and drove away. So what do you think? Do you think these women did the right thing? What would you have done? Domestic violence and domestic abuse, same thing. It's a hidden epidemic. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been physically abused by an intimate partner during their lifetime. It is a hidden epidemic. But what should we do about it? What did Jesus say? I would like you to follow along as I read a passage from Luke chapter 10. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is every person you come across in your life. That is your neighbor. What does it mean to love your neighbor? Loving your neighbor means that you stop when you see somebody suffering. You stop for that person and you love that person. You do whatever it takes to love them. How do we read this story in the context of domestic abuse? One thing we see is that the victim is half dead. This is so similar to a victim of domestic abuse. This victim feels half dead. They've been beaten down so much that they're just barely living. And it also points out that we have choices. When we see domestic abuse around us, we have choices. We could ignore it. We just walk on by, like the Pharisee, like the Levite. We could just walk on by. We could think, someone else will help. I don't have time. It's not my business. I don't know how to help. Or we could stop and help. We could give immediate aid when we see they're in pain. We must not assume that the victim has provoked the attack. We must not ask, what did you do that made that abuser hurt you? And we must believe the victim. Victims have suffered trauma. And so a lot of times they're disoriented. They will contradict themselves. You'll think they're making up a story because they just don't make sense. This is typical for a victim, but you've got to believe them. Check up on the victim. This is what the Samaritan did. We can do that to show that we love them. So let's look at some possible scenarios and responses to 4 different types of possibilities. As long as the abuser doesn't find out, it's safe to speak privately to the victim. It's very important that it's private and confidential. Let the victim know that you are there to listen confidentially if they want to talk. Point to resources and help with a safety plan. So scenario number 1, witnessing physical violence, as in this story that happened in Diamond Bar. You could call the police. What happens when you call the police? You could be saving the life of the victim. You could also be, when the police come, they give a report, so that when the victim's ready to leave the abuse, there's evidence of a police report. You could video it to have more evidence, or you could even step in and take a risk. Am I going to be hurt by this abuser? Is it worth the risk? Am I strong enough? So you have options. Scenario number 2, hearing about physical violence without witnessing it. In that case, should you call the police? No, you should not, because then the life of the victim is in jeopardy even more. Because when the abuser finds out, he gets angry. Scenario number 3, witnessing emotional abuse. So let's say you're with a group of friends and one spouse is condescending toward the other spouse or humiliating the other spouse, saying things that are not so nice. If you are a friend with the abuser, you can definitely call that out and say to the abuser, you know what, that seems a little harsh, or that was not very nice what you just said. And that lets the victim also know that, wow, somebody also thinks this is not right. Because she thinks in her head, this is normal. If nobody says anything especially, she thinks, oh, this is just what people do. Scenario number 4, hearing about emotional abuse without witnessing it. Should you confront the abuser? No, because you're not a witness to it. And so that abuser is going to know that the victim said something to somebody. How do you love an abuser? One of the things is to require change. We are not loving an abuser when we ignore their abuse and tolerate and say, oh, just pretend it doesn't exist. That's not loving them. Is it possible for an abuser to change? Some people say no. Some experts who have talked to many victims of abuse say, no, it is not possible for abusers to change. But we have a great God. God can change anyone. I don't care. He can do it. And I've seen it. And one of our speakers today has seen it multiple times. One of the ways that Jesus loved the Pharisees is to not ignore the oppression, to not tolerate the abuse. They were taking advantage of people who were vulnerable, and this is what abusers do. They're so similar. He did not tolerate it. Why are we tolerating abusers? Call into account for unkind behavior. This is what needs to happen, and this needs to happen with friends who witness it. It needs to happen. God will judge the abuser. God hates abuse, and he will judge it. So why not help them change now before it's too late? If you really want to help in abuse situations, learn more. Get involved with a domestic abuse ministry, like Domestic Kindness. We equip your church to be part of the solution to domestic abuse through education about domestic abuse and godly character, primarily, through workshops, Bible studies, referrals for help, such as support groups, shelters, domestic abuse counselors, books, batterers interventions, services for victims. We are there to send you to those resources. We don't provide them, we send you to those. We train a group of church members who become a permanent domestic kindness action team at their church. You can be God's instrument in your church. You can make a difference, and we would like to help you do that.